Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Ofrona Mabu, and I'm a Senior Research Associate with the Urban Institute. We're so glad to have you here for the panel on advancing equitable access to good quality jobs. I want to share that closed captions are available, and you can show or adjust the closed captions by using the Hide or Show Captions button. All participants are muted. You can type your questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards and also shared with attendees via email. During the event, I will share a preview of our upcoming report entitled Job Quality and Race and Gender Equity, Understanding the Link Between Job Quality and Occupational Crowding. Following that brief presentation, we will be joined by a panel, which includes Pat Carey, Assistant Commissioner with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Office of Current Employment Analysis, and Zinga Hooper, Policy Director for the National Black Worker Center, Enrique Lopez Lira, the Director of the Low Wage Work Program at the UC Berkeley Center for Labor Research and Education, Kavya Vogel, co-founder of the Translational Research Service. Their biographies will be available online and also are shared via link in the chat. Following the panel, we'll have a Q&A from the audience, so please feel free to make use of the Q&A box. We'll also ask that you please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete a survey at the end of the event. That's also available in the chat box. So thank you so much again for joining. I will start with sharing a few highlights from our upcoming report, Job Quality and Race and Gender Equity, Understanding the Link Between Job Quality and Occupational Crowding. You can go to the next slide. We know that job quality is important for worker well-being. We also know that quality employment is not distributed equitably. We want to learn more about where this occurs at the occupation level. So we conducted a review of major definitions of job quality and identified 11 indicators from publicly accessible data that we could link to occupations. The indicators we examined were related to pay, hours and scheduling, non-wage benefits like health insurance and retirement, job security, working conditions, training and advancement, and finally, worker voice. We looked at occupations at the 4-digit Standard Occupational Classification, or SOC code level, and ended up with 108 occupations with sufficient data for this analysis. What we did was come up with a ranking for each indicator and occupation. And if we found that an occupation's value for, let's say, a regular schedule was better than average for all occupations, the occupation received 1 point for scheduling. But if the occupation's value for an indicator like scheduling was worse than average, the occupation received 0 points. We then calculated a job quality score, which is the sum from all 11 indicators, and we interpret a higher total score as a better overall occupation. Go to the next slide. When we calculated this job quality score for each occupation, we found that scores range from as little as 1 point to as much as 10 points. And the average score was 5.8, and the most frequent total scores were 7 or 8. A few occupations were very below average. We did find that there tended to be a link between the overall job quality score and pay. Go to the next slide. To provide a few examples, there were 3 occupations with the lowest job quality score of 1. And these were occupations like other food preparation workers, retail sales workers, and agricultural workers. These 3 occupations also ranked low when it came to pay. Next slide. There are 2 occupations with the highest job quality score of 10. There's an occupation called Other Business Operations Specialists, and the second was Health and Safety Specialists. These occupations also ranked as better than average in terms of pay. There were a handful of occupations not shown here that did have an overall job quality score that's higher than the average of 5.8, but is actually considered low wage. So just to share a couple of examples of those, they include baggage porters and also an occupation called Other Office and Administrative Support Workers. Next slide. We then took all these 108 occupations with their job quality scores and looked at occupational crowding. Occupational crowding, which is a theory and method developed by Barbara Bergman in the 1970s, measures the degree to which groups are over, under, or proportionally represented in occupations, taking educational requirements of a role into account and also educational attainment of that group. The crowding score divides the actual share of a group in an occupation by what's expected based on their educational attainment. Crowding score 0.9 or less indicates underrepresentation or crowding out. Again, taking into account educational requirements, and a score more than 1.1 indicates overrepresentation or crowding in. We examined occupational crowding among 6 race and gender groups that were aged 25 to 64. And these were Black women, Black men, Latinx women, Latinx men, white women, and white men. Go to the next slide. We compared where groups were overrepresented and where groups were underrepresented. We noticed a lower average job quality score where Black women, Black men, Latinx women, Latinx men, white women are overrepresented in occupations compared to when they were underrepresented. So for example, for Black women, the crowding score on average was 4.8 where they were overrepresented, but much higher, 6.2, where they were underrepresented. We found the reverse trend was true for white men. We also looked further at the direction of the relationship between crowding scores and the total job quality score using simple linear regression. We found that as job quality scores increase, we notice a decrease in the share of Black women, Black men, Latinx women, Latinx men, and white women as compared to white men. In contrast, higher quality roles tend to have a higher concentration of white men as compared to the economy. Next slide. So this research sheds light on the importance of improving job quality overall in multiple dimensions and the need to reduce occupational disparities by race and gender. We also know that there's a need for enhanced data on different aspects of job quality that are linked to occupations and also indicators that reflect workers' needs. So that's a quick summary of the upcoming report, and I'll transition us to the panel and invite the panelists to join us. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you being here today. So I want to ask everyone to please share your reactions to the report and how this lines up to your observations when it comes to job quality and equity based on the work that you do. I'd love to start with Enrique.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. So just for the benefit of the audience, my name is Enrique Lopez-Lira. I'm the director of the low-wage work program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. And yeah, I think this is important and timely work. I think adding the human capital aspect to the job quality analysis is also an important lens for looking at equity issues that we all work on. I would say I'm not surprised that the occupations with the lowest job quality scores are low-wage occupations. And I'm also not surprised that holding educational attainment constant workers of color are still overrepresented in those low-road jobs. We saw this throughout the pandemic when women, immigrants, workers of color were more vulnerable to pandemic-related job losses because of occupational segregation. And it is important to note that the pandemic didn't cause this, right? The labor market conditions prior to the pandemic had already laid the foundation for these disparities, this disparate experiences during the pandemic to manifest themselves. There was a recent study published in the NBER that found similar results to your study, mainly that considerable racial occupation persists in terms of segregation in the labor market, regardless of educational attainment. And these structural issues are beyond education, right? The education narrative alone doesn't address them all. I believe one of the authors of the study, Dr. Peter Blair, said the core thing is how much race matters. And I think that's an important thing to highlight. One thing that stood out is that if you think about, I'm a labor economist by training, and if you think about in economics, this idea of compensating wage differentials, which is that when you can think of workers when they take a job, they're selling their labor, and in exchange, they're buying amenities in the job, and the way they pay for those amenities is through the wage that they accept, right? So you're willing to take a lower wage if you have better amenities in your job. and so forth. I think that your study highlights that that doesn't hold true for many occupations, especially low-wage occupations. And so I think the idea of job quality as a bundle, which I think you mentioned in the report, that there's some of the research shows that job quality is provided as a bundle, seems to be a better explanation than this idea of compensating wage differentials, at least for most low-wage occupations. But then the question is, why are employers able to offer low job quality bundles in these occupations? And I think the answer, at least in part, is the relative power of workers and employers. And so it's a question of power. And we can talk more about power when we get to the solutions part of your question. But those are sort of my initial reactions to the report.
I'm happy to jump in with some thoughts as well. Just for the sake of the audience, first and foremost, thanks so much for having me as part of this important discussion. I'm Kavya Vagel, co-founder of both Translational Research Service, which is a research and data visualization firm that's focused on workers and job quality issues, as well as the soon-to-be-launched Living Wage Institute, which is a new benefit corporation that's helping employers build and implement living wage compensation strategies by leveraging data, unpacking insights, and tracking their impact on workers and businesses over time. Prior to launching these new ventures, I was senior director at Just Capital, senior director of research at Just Capital, and a senior research analyst at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, where I delved mostly into job quality issues, both in the federal and corporate policy ecosystems. And now a lot of the work that I do is focused on connecting job quality, equitable outcomes data, and the role that employers implicitly and explicitly play in it all. So just in thinking about it from this data background, my first reaction to the report was I really commend the authors for taking a very creative approach to unpacking the state of job quality for workers, especially in the absence of consistent data on job quality practices, performance, and outcomes. I think it's hard to overstate how barren the landscape is when it comes to data, and thinking about connecting the occupational level indicators and some job quality features together and trying to analyze it from a racial and gender equity perspective is no easy task. So I really appreciate that work and think that it's a really nice approach. Really similar to what Enrique said, I think there are three things that were implicit findings that stood out to me in the report. And the first one is similarly on kind of this compensation piece and the understanding that a driver of the variation in the overall job quality score was pay. I think there's a lot of survey research that indicates that for workers in particular, pay and wages are a top priority. But to your whole point, this is a bundle, the package, the full package of job quality indicators and metrics and features are really important to it. But at the same time, there's the implication here, the solution here is really around the importance of using wages as a primary lever to really greatly and massively improve job quality for a number of workers. And I think it's an important thing. And to Enrique's point, power plays a really big role in that dynamic around wage setting. The second was the heart of the report, which was that as job quality score increases, occupational crowding significantly decreases for Black women, Black men, Latinx women, Latinx men, and white women in comparison to white men. And to me, what this is it's adding yet another data point to a field of evidence that showcases the persistent and longstanding and pernicious effects of systemic racial and gender discrimination in the US labor market. And I think that more evidence for this, especially in the realm of job quality, like your report accentuated, is really important to getting data at the disaggregated level to keep showcasing this. And the third, I think, is also consistent with other research, which is that the occupations that we see and label as essential, like caregiving, food preparation, and cleaning, are some of the lowest quality jobs. And again, it's just signaling that we need a dramatic shift in how we value certain types of work, and a really cognizant approach that actively addressing it also has implications that are tied to systemic racism and sexism in the labor market. And so I agree and really appreciate all that Enrique added to this as well. And also just emphasize that it's hard to do this type of work without the right data to be able to get at job quality.
Afternoon, folks. Thank you for that. My name is Nzinga. I'm the policy director at the National Black Worker Center. And, most of our work is around supporting Black workers in empower building. So appreciate you, Enrique, talking about the significance of that in this space, and also political education and leadership developments, and using my experiences and skills to serve that work. So I really appreciate this discussion and the report. And I appreciate seeing the data in the report because it really supports what workers' experiences tell us, what their stories show us, that Black workers continue, Latinx workers continue to face discrimination in the job market. It hasn't gone anywhere, whether you're talking about recruitment, hiring, promotions, work conditions, that it's still an issue that we struggle with. And despite, the passage of civil rights legislation and labor laws, many Black workers in this country are still working for low wages in unhealthy and unsafe workplaces that this report talks about. We still experience discrimination and racism amongst a number of issues. So many of the metrics in that report use some of those factors to determine the quality of the job. So what we discuss is the stories that share with us that too many workers are struggling with these issues. And the report and the data help support that, because workers are finding it hard to get quality jobs that that guarantee dignity, jobs that pay, family supporting wages, that offer consistent schedules and provide work support. So it was cool to see that a lot of those same things that workers are telling us they need in order for it to be a quality job is the metrics in here that this report highlighted. So appreciate that data. And it also, oftentimes poor job quality is blamed on individual workers and on so-called skills gaps. So this report really lays it at the feet of systems that have created these conditions. And this information provided here really helps advocates and organizers to push against those mythological narratives that employers and policymakers really rely on. And one of the pictures that this report paints is really grim, that the average job quality score was 5.8 out of 11, and that many of the jobs that we depend on to do our work fell on the lower end. And you named some of those, like the food preparation workers, agricultural workers, personal care and service workers, all had a score of 1 out of 11. And how outrageous that is, and that those jobs are actually overcrowded by Black and Latinx workers. The report was discussing how nearly 1/3 of Black women work in bad jobs that have low pay. And I know that was one of the biggest factors, but it's also we're the likeliest to be disappointed by the quality of jobs. So that data really affirms one of the main campaigns that we are leading, which is a Black Worker Bill of Rights, the need for such a thing. Because if you look at all this data, you look at any statistic, Black workers are really struggling. We face high unemployment rates, low wages, unsafe jobs, significantly higher instances of workplace discrimination, you name it. The work that we are engaged in at NBWC, along with a number of our coalition members that we chair, is this data helps us support our work. And what do we do now that we have this data to support those stories that we have been telling? And a lot of that is we're acting to prevent this data from continuing to be the reality by creating this Black-led national policy agenda to improve job quality. So that is our mission right now. So I really appreciate this report because they'll help us support a lot of the talking points when we're talking with workers and policymakers.
Sure, I'm echoing a lot of everybody's comments here going last year, but as a data person and from a data perspective, I think what stood out to me is the use of the varied data sets for coming up with these job quality measures. And my first read through of the approach is really interesting to me, given the need to look at fairly detailed occupational data. So you're to be commended on that. And I think I'm echoing Kavya's comment regarding this was a very creative approach to this, and also recognize that the data landscape, it's always changing. Everyone wants more and more and more, and it's hard to fill needs all the time given budget constraints and low response rates and so forth. So I do appreciate the work that was done to do this. And kind of echoing Enrique's comments, you know, the overall findings showing, I mean, I think all the panel members said this, showing Black women and men and Latinx women and men and white women tending to be underrepresented in occupations with higher wages is similar to the other data that we see, right? For in other surveys. So with the earnings survey or the earnings data that we have by race and gender that show similar overall disparities in earnings. And I believe there's a connection in the paper between the occupations with higher wages and occupations that have higher job quality scores. I think we made that connection, which I thought was important. So the overall findings are very consistent with what we're seeing, and but having the occupational information detail, I thought was very valuable here.
Thank you so much, everyone. So another question, Zinga raised a good point that the average job quality score that we found was 5.8 out of, a possible total of 11. What trends are you seeing or expect to see when it comes to job quality? And I'd love to start with Kavya for that one.
Yeah. Again, I want to couch all of my answers in the reality that there's currently insufficient data infrastructure to measure job quality holistically in a way, but through smaller studies, we know that job quality, which has most traditionally been measured and historically been measured through wages and hours, has been on the decline. And the pandemic, like Enrique said, wasn't necessarily the cause of it. It was an exacerbant of it. And it really showcased how fragile all of it has been. What's more, I think different job quality elements, inclusive of pay, benefits, hours, working conditions, mobility, and worker experience, the data for all of that is showing that it's lower job quality standards for Black and Latinx workers and women. And this comes in the form, like Nzinga already talked about, around lower pay, lower promotion rates, larger benefit gaps when it comes to health insurance in particular, greater lack of access to paid family leave, more involuntary part-time work, greater workplace discrimination, even lower levels of autonomy and control in the workplace, and so much more. I think from my research perspective, I've recently been taking a look at it through the employer lens and the employer-specific data. And I found that employers can directly impact job quality through their own investments, policies, and practices, and that employer level data can enable job seekers, customers, investors, government agencies, and advocates to make more informed decisions and take more informed action around job quality in particular. But again, this data landscape is particularly sparse and non-standardized, and there's low disclosure across employers. So it makes it very difficult to actually track job quality performance, let alone differentials in job quality between different racial and ethnic groups and genders. In work that I'd previously done at Just Capital, we actually spent a lot of time tracking job quality data disclosure among Russell 1000 companies. So these are the largest employers, places like Apple, Microsoft, Walmart, Starbucks, McDonald's, that have huge employment populations. And we found that even among 20 key human capital metric disclosures, the disclosure rate was under 20% for the 100 largest employers, and an expanded version of this research has recently showcased that across the full Russell 1000, for many of the different metrics that track job quality or could potentially track something about job quality, disclosure rates are under 40%. It's markedly low, which again gives you a sense of why might this be happening. And one of the reasons that we've unpacked is that companies tend to disclose lower job quality tend to disclose on job quality performance in particular, only if it looks good or close to perfect. So even that 40% disclosure may not actually be inclusive of the differential outcomes and measurements that can tell us much about whether workers are actually benefiting from these quality jobs. So again, all of this is to say that there's kind of a mask around the quality of jobs, and job quality is actually much poorer than we expect it to be, even amongst these large employers who are able to provide a tremendous number of benefits due to kind of like large revenue sizes and resourcing. And what's more is when we think about performance on equity in particular, it's considered only in pockets by a number of employers who look at kind of disclosure on these issues. There are trends where employers in particular will measure things like workforce diversity and representation or pay equity. And this captures some amount of information about equity or inequity between races and ethnicities and genders in a workforce, but doesn't again provide that comprehensive picture on the state of job quality. And again, we see even in the little performance data that we get that the state of job quality is pretty poor, even among the employer data.
Any other panelists want to jump in on that? Trends that you're seeing or expect to see when it comes to overall state of job quality?
Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah, I think we'll continue to see workers demand better job quality, right? So workers will vote with their feet, as economists like to say, and we saw some of that in the so-called Great Resignation, which really was a great reshuffling and primarily driven by wages. But I think now it's sort of beyond wages, is expecting overall better conditions at work, and that's being manifested through formal and informal organizing. So there's been a lot of talk in the press about hot labor summer and all the various labor movements that are happening and strikes throughout the U.S. at various industries and sectors. And that will probably, hot labor summer will probably continue through the fall as well. You have large strikes that are still taking place, like SAG-AFTRA, Writers Guild, where large numbers of workers who are striking for a long time. It's not clear when a resolution will occur. But I think another important trend in terms of job quality to think about is that the definition of job quality will continue to expand. Not just wages and benefits, but other dimensions as well. Again, think of the AI concerns in the SAG-AFTRA strike, as well as other issues with technology, for example, surveillance and monitoring of workers, which again, low-wage workers are represented in those occupations where those technologies are being deployed. My colleague, Annetta Bernhardt at the UC Berkeley Labor Center started a program a couple years ago called Technology and Work, where she's providing worker organizations and policymakers with research and analysis and training so they can respond to this rapid technological change. And more importantly, to make sure that the technologies are benefiting workers and not harming them. So I think an important trend in job quality is that this definition is expanding of what a good job really means to workers. It's not just wages and benefits anymore. There's other dimensions to it.
Yeah, and I can add to what Enrique just shared as far as some of the social trends that we've been seeing as far as its connection to narratives and values, which I think a lot of what Enrique was talking about was the value system and wanting jobs that align with our values in addition to better pay and wages. So one of the positive trends we've been seeing around narratives is amongst workers and worker organizations, a shift from what are the qualities jobs out there that you want to strive to get? You know, the narrative that was out there when I was growing up and looking for a job was you want to become a medical doctor or a lawyer or in the sciences, because those are the jobs that's going to give you a decent pay. But that's shifting to ensuring that all jobs, no matter if you have a particular education or job type, that all jobs are quality jobs, not accepting that some would just be a low wage job and others that you have to get specialized skill set in will be a good job, but that any job that our young people want to be in, current people want to be in is a good job. So one of the things that the narratives that I see is that jobs were considered, or the narrative was that jobs were entry-level positions that don't require skills. If you want a job that pays well, you need to get a profession that requires a specialized skill set, and that kind of links to the narrative around unskilled and skilled labor. In recent years, we're seeing organizations push more against that all jobs require a skill set, and that this unskilled labor is a myth that companies create in order to justify paying some people low wages. So I'm seeing a positive trend in more people using that language and talking about those narratives. And then as far as like the value system, another important trend is workers are determined whether or not a job is of quality based on whether or not it aligns with their values, especially younger people. So in addition to those factors we were looking at in this report, like pay, benefits, job security, which is all necessary, the pandemic really forced a lot of workers to examine our choices about how we want to spend our time and our energy. So in addition to those markers that this report talks about, job quality is being based on whether or not it allows for deeper connections with our family and community. Not so much time dedicated to our jobs, flexibility, feeling autonomous in all aspects of our work. Like we have some control over what we do, personal growth, holistic well-being, shared purpose. So I'm hopeful that job quality will continue to trend in this direction.
Thanks so much for sharing all of that. Another question, if you want to add more flavor to this, of how the quality of jobs impacts the lives of workers generally, and also Black and Latinx workers specifically, that was focused on in this report. I'd like to invite Nzinga to share first.
Yeah, I actually saw this post, and some people might say, you know, that's pretty loud, but one of the lawyers that I follow posted that the workplace is killing me. And we see that low quality jobs are a major factor in our stress levels and our physical and our mental health. The quality of a job, especially because we spend so much of our day at work, can determine our quality of life. So I appreciate all the factors that the report looked at, and we can make direct connections if we were to look at any of those factors. If we were to take pay, we actually spend a lot of time in the Black Worker Bill of Rights stressing the need for equitable pay, because if workers don't receive sufficient pay to support themselves and their family, right, a lot of issues arise: housing instability, food insecurity, access to low quality education. So we can look at any of those components. We can look at job security. You know, during the pandemic, a lot of research was coming out about Black workers who were reporting unsafe job conditions, you know, and that was leading to terminations, firing. So we can look at the direct consequences of not having job security and how that impacts your life. Career advancement is a big one, especially with Black workers. There was a survey that came out in 2021 that showed that 44% of Black workers feel that they are overlooked or intentionally passed over for a career advancement opportunity because of their race. And looking at the data in this report, we see where Black women are overcrowded. It's not in managerial or senior level positions. Black women represent the single most educated group of workers, but we remain less likely to hold senior positions when compared to our white counterparts. So I think we can just trace any of those components to how it impacts our families directly. And just the last thing I'm going to say is that these low quality jobs are being marketed right now as a benefit to workers because of this notion of flexibility and opportunity to be your own boss. But it's impacting a lot of workers in app-based work in the gig industry, because there's this trade-off that happens where instead of getting sufficient pay and legal protections that a lot of employees have in job security and work benefits, they push this idea of flexibility that you can choose when you start work, which is really dependent on your financial needs, right? Instead of having flexibility and those protections and benefits. And in some jobs, I think the report highlighted that women were choosing lower pay in exchange for flexibility in scheduling. And a lot of the jobs are doing that, having this trade-off of certain benefits. And I think that really determines for a lot of people what the quality of job would be. And a quality job doesn't have to have those trade-offs.
If I'll jump in. So yeah, I agree with everything Nzinga mentioned. Yeah, I think it's a false choice, right? To say many times that, you know, the flexibility that you're trading off for the low pay, sometimes it's out of necessity that you make that trade, not really because you're wanting to make that trade. But just in terms of, yeah, Black and Latinx workers, I think as Nzinga pointed out, there's you know, having a low-road job leads to other socioeconomic issues, not just for the workers, but for their families as well. So, and again, this is especially true for women and workers of color, So we see that in lower educational attainment outcomes for kids and where workers have low pay, low quality jobs, poor health outcomes, risk of homelessness, economic insecurity in old age, and Latino and Black workers are overrepresented in all those categories. And there's, you can talk about correlation versus causality, but there's a clear relationship there between the low road jobs and some of these other factors. I was testifying at a legislative hearing in Sacramento not too long ago, and there were some workers who were talking about, these were healthcare workers who were essential during the pandemic, and you could just see the burnout and the stress in their voices, and it was really heartbreaking just to hear just the scheduling, how it affects how much time they can spend with their kids, or whether they can pay for after school activities because they have not enough to make ends meet. And so a lot of the inability to provide for your family also adds to the stress and negative outcomes from low road jobs. So it's not just to the worker, but the families as well.
Great, thank you so much. One of the things that came up as we were doing this research, of course, was the limitations of the data that was available to us. So for example, there are probably other job quality indicators are important, but we didn't have access to those at the occupation level, and things that are important to workers that we also just didn't have access to. Many of you touched on the fact that job quality really is more than wages. So what other data or metrics would you like to see to better understand job quality and racial equity? I'd love to start with Pat for that one.
Okay, so I thought I thought the study touched on the major job quality metrics. But one thing that when I was reading the paper, one thing that kind of occurred to me that it would be, as a data guy, would nice to be include a geographic component to the research that would get at whether under or over representativeness of groups or workers varies by geography. That would be interesting to me. I realize that stretches some of the data sets even thinner, and some of the job quality measures may not even be available at that granular level. But there may be some larger aggregations of geography that could be done, such as region or division breakouts or something like that. The other thing that kind of occurred to me has to do with the time comparison. We're in a post-pandemic period right now. What we're seeing here at BLS, I know this doesn't get at job quality, so I apologize, but we're seeing that prime working age women are having their highest employment population ratios ever. Black unemployment, while high, is reaching some of its series lows. It's touching series lows periodically. Post-pandemic, we're seeing some higher quits, people transitioning to other jobs. So the tight labor market. So I'm just kind of curious how that's all going to play out in this. The workers having a little bit more control, and employers needing to find workers, and how that plays out. Yeah, and you did mention, I think in the paper that, I think you just mentioned it too, about preferences, like for job quality, that, yeah, if you could figure out how to do that, that would be great to include in terms of measures of job quality for certain groups, I think, because, people at different stages of life, and people have different, value different things. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to mention, and this is just some things that I'm aware of, and you may be interested in, but in terms of job equity, or the issue of equity, is we were interested in seeing the results of our contingent worker supplement that CPS fielded in July of 2023, so just a couple months ago. That should provide some insight into the workers who do not have implicit or explicit contracts for ongoing employment, and also gets at alternative work arrangements. And it also has some information on health insurance coverage. So that's something to keep an eye out for 2024. I don't mean to be doing these shameless plugs, but the CPS work schedule supplement is something that we're going to put out. We're going to field in September of 2024. So work schedules is an element of your job quality index, so it might be of interest. So we're excited to field that as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention too is, you know, some of the longitudinal surveys are you know, maybe great at trying to assess or determine you know, issues or identify issues where equity is a concern. And the National Longitudinal Survey is going to do a new cohort starting in 2026. So I just wanted to let you know that.
I'm happy to jump in with some thoughts again from really the employer level. I think that one of the great things about the report is that it focused on occupation, and it gives folks an idea of what occupations might have better job quality. To some degree, it allows for decision making, but that employer level data is really one level that will allow workers to make choices about which employers they go to, who they choose to work with, and really, like Enrique was saying, like move with their feet or vote with their feet in some way across employers. And so that's why the need for that employer level data is so high. Through work that I've done with my colleagues, Matt Walsh and Sarah Horowitz, with the Families and Workers Fund, we've spent a lot of time trying to fill the gaps in job quality data for employers in particular. And there are a number of different frameworks that exist. I think there have been upwards of 20 major organizations that have released frameworks for what job quality is. But what's missing from a number of those frameworks are what are the actual tactical ways to measure it? How do you actually go about measuring it as an employer? What does good reporting and performance on those metrics look like? How do you assess whether those outcomes are equitable? And what are the levers that actually meaningfully change those differential outcomes in some way? And so as part of this work, what we've done is conducted a landscape analysis of over 300 metrics to identify the full breadth of metrics that are currently in use when it comes to job quality. We mapped all of these metrics to the multiple frameworks, inclusive of the Good Jobs Champions statement that Families and Workers Fund put out, as well as the Department of Labor's job quality definitions, among a number of others. And we identified additional gaps in the measurement to propose novel metrics to fill them with where there wasn't coverage, in particular areas like scheduling, worker voice and representation, were places where there were a lack of metrics. And then we finally winnowed this down to 20 metrics and calculations that were based on specific criteria. Some of the notable metrics that we identified that haven't been seeing in a number of the different analyses, just because the data doesn't exist for it at the employer level, and even in kind of the larger federal statistical survey data set levels, is the ratio of the minimum wage at a given employer to the living wage, the hours utilization rate, the percentage of workers who are eligible for paid sick leave, the average percentage of employers' contributions to healthcare premiums, the average percentage of a worker's salary that's contributed by the employer to retirement, participation rates in non-compliance training, percentage of workers who are in ESPP or ESOP programs, so that's the stock ownership programs, the percentage of the workforce represented by unions, or things like employee net promoter score that gives a sense of employees' own sentiment around whether their workplace is one that they'd recommend to their friends. Alone, I think many of these, of the 20 metrics that we've built, can provide a more holistic picture of what job quality might look like among employers. But as we've been talking about on this panel, to really understand inequities in job quality outcomes, the added value is that each of these metrics, instead of one or two that are focused on equity, are all disaggregable. And so every single metric, the way that we recommend using it is to disaggregate the data by gender, race, and worker type. So that's part-time worker, full-time worker, contract worker, so on, in order to be able to understand the differentials between what workers on average might look like in terms of job quality versus what weighted by the different population levels of each of those workers might be within the organization or employer. And that gives you a sense of really the contrast between, whether it's job quality on net looks good or whether there are actual differentials between workers. And so I think that in addition to having metrics that really are focused on job quality outcomes and measured specifically for employers, those disaggregations are the next level of what's necessary in order to really paint a picture of whether any of these outcomes on job quality are actually equitable across different workers.
And I'll just briefly add that, as I mentioned earlier, I think the definition of what job quality is changing a little bit. So I would also think it's important to add measures of housing insecurity, transportation, both access to reliable transportation, but also looking at the time tax that a lot of these workers face in terms of traveling to work. And then childcare is also a big component of that. We saw some of this in some of the strikes that happened recently, right? The LA hotel workers strike. A lot of that had to do with housing insecurity and travel time. More than half of the workers in the LA travel 50 miles to work. It's kind of crazy. And so, and then we saw that at the University of California system, right? It was one of the largest academic strikes ever. And a big part of that was the housing and transportation insecurity that a lot of the graduate students are feeling right now. So this is important in California, but I think it's important in other parts of the US as well. So I would add those metrics as part of the job quality measure as well.
Thank you so much. We've seen and we've heard so much from you about all the issues involving job quality and how so many workers are left out of quality and secure, stable employment. What solutions do you see that could help improve the quality of jobs for all workers and certainly various race and gender groups? If you could share anything that you think might be successful, whether it comes to the role of employers, policy, data, or something else entirely. Would love to start with Nzinga for that one.
Yeah, I think workers having control over our labor, power building, organizing, that would be the short answer. Organizing, whether it's in a union or worker center or a non-union organization, is a path to improving job quality. Workers organize around the markers that we had here around pay and benefits and demanding that employers embrace those qualities will improve the conditions of many jobs that workers are currently in. And I'll just name two tools that are supporting worker organizing. Worker standards boards are a few things that are being proposed in different states that are staffed by workers and community members, where that board has real authority to change industry standards. I think it's a good solution that a number of cities are testing out. And also worker bills of rights and the potential there to change labor laws that have remained in the way of workers fighting for changes in job quality. So in addition to the Black Worker Bill of Rights that we're advocating for, we're also supporting the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, the Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights, there's a Part-Time Worker Bill of Rights. So all these different Bill of Rights are potential tools to change labor laws that really have affected workers' ability to even organize and demand better conditions on the job. So that's some of the solutions that our partners and we are working on.
I'll jump in. So I think in terms of employers, they can enter into high-road training partnerships with labor. There was a recent New York Times article highlighting such a partnership with Truro Health, which my colleague at the Labor Center, Pam Egan, has been working on, and it's a partnership between Kaiser and SEIU. The partnership offers skills and training, workforce development in healthcare occupations that are in demand with employers, but also provides a pathway to economic mobility through high-road jobs for those workers who go through the program. I think in terms of policy, there's federal things and state things that could be done, right? So at the federal level, obviously the federal minimum wage should be raised to keep up with inflation at the minimum. But yeah, I mentioned childcare, right? And President Biden had a pretty robust proposal on childcare on the Build Back Better bill, but as you know, most of that did not make the Inflation Reduction Act bill, and about 3 million children could lose childcare when the funding from runs out, the emergency funding runs out this month, I believe. So there's policy that can be done in terms of childcare. Like Nzinga said, organizing, making it easier for workers to organize. The PRO Act stalled in Congress, but that would make it easier for workers to organize. But there's things that are happening in terms of the National Labor Relations Board. If you are not familiar with the CEMEX case, that's a big ruling that just came out that would make it easier for workers to choose the representative without having to go through an election unless there's a petition filed by the employer. It's an important change in the framework of that. And then also enforcing existing laws, misclassification, wage theft, child labor laws. You know, in California, there's a bill that just is moving to the floor, trying to change the laws to make sure that especially immigrant children are not being exploited by working in order to provide for their family. So there's lots of, in terms of policy at the state and federal level, that can help improve worker power.
In addition to everything Nzinga and Enrique have said, I think there's two things on the employer side that I'd love to touch on. The first is living wages. At its simplest, a living wage is what one worker would need to earn on an hourly basis to cover the cost of their family's minimum basic needs where they live. And I think that for employers, you know, there's so many, you know, concerns around turnover, workforce attraction, and all of these elements of operations, finance, and even the social impact that they're having. And considering living wage as part of a standard part of their benchmarking efforts, I think is really critical, because other benchmarking techniques that are currently being used, looking at the existing labor market data, seem to be perpetuating all of these inequitable pay practices. And so thinking about resetting and using a living wage as a benchmark standard in the process for what people need to earn is a really strong way to incorporate, you know, this concept into compensation practice. And so I think that that is kind of one lever for employers where they can really dig in and at the very least become aware of the differences, but at the best also think about increasing wages for their workers. The second is using procurement, which I think has implications for both employers themselves as well as policy. The way in which, you know, the governments find suppliers and the way in which employers themselves find suppliers is a really robust process. And if we chose to embed job quality standards into those practices, whether at first that looked like the data on job quality, being able to report it or having a requirement to report certain job quality data to an employer that's procuring or a government agency that's procuring, could be one step to getting a better understanding of what the actual state of job quality could be. But then on the other side, as time progresses and reporting improves, you can also imagine that there's specific standards that could be set for the types of policies in place or provisions in place, as well as the outcomes that an employer procuring organization sets for these suppliers. And what that looks like can dramatically, I think, shift what we see as outcomes in job quality looking like and what equity looks like as well.
Great. And Pat, is there anything you'd like to add?
I would just, you know, we certainly in terms of the role of data, it is important to have good data. I recognize that there can be a desert out there in terms of job quality measures. So the work that you do is the work that you've done is certainly valuable. You know, surveys. I have to say it's a challenging environment right now in terms of response rates. It's harder to get to respondents. And on the other hand, there's data users and researchers would like more granular levels of data, and it's, things are not going the same direction there. So it is a challenging environment. I think I would certainly say that while surveys aren't going away, surveys and administrative data, will be important in these endeavors, and creative ways to use these data, such as what is in the report, are going to be very valuable going forward.
Great. Thank you all so much for your incredibly valuable insights. I really want to thank everyone for joining us today. That wraps up our event. I want to remind everyone that we will share a recording of this event, as well as a link to the report when it's available. We'll also share information on the speakers and their bios. And we'd also love if you could please fill out an event survey as well, which is showing up now in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and we appreciate it and look forward to seeing you at a future event.